Right, so welcome everyone to the latest episode of Clarity's CISO panel. We're really excited to have our guest here, Matt Martin, who's CEO and founder of Two Candlesticks. Matt's had 25 years of experience in cyber and security, and so we're really delighted to have him here today. We're going to cover a range of topics, but really focus on supply chain issues, specifically around the emerging threats of AI. So we'll jump straight into it. And Matt, would you just sort of introduce yourself in a bit more detail, please?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. This is really, really cool to be here in London and recording this in person versus, over Zoom or Teams or whatever. But yeah, so I am the founder CEO of Two Candlesticks. We're a full service cybersecurity consulting firm. We work all over the globe. Primary focus is with small, medium businesses and then working as well with developing countries with a huge passion of mine to work in Africa and kind of bring up the global level of security. And so this is my way of trying to do that. Before this, I spent about 20 years in security working for Fortune 500 financial services firms. So I've been at this for quite a while.
Amazing.
And Matt, you've had a busy schedule the last couple of weeks, right? Traveling all
Yeah,
over the world. So appreciate you making the time to
absolutely.
speak to us today.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. So I think we started at quite a high level, sort of macro level, and focusing in on supply chain issues. Where do you think the biggest, I guess, threats are at the moment, or opportunities even, or just like at a high level, what's happening in the industry right now?
Yeah, so I think if you look back from 2024, there's a few major events that happened, right? And everybody's very well aware of CrowdStrike. And I remember that night when it happened, I was on a flight to San Diego across the US. And if you go back and look at the little flight graphs where you see planes or whatever out in the air, that night you can see one plane lonely going across the US, and that was my plane. Like I was like
Wow.
one of the last ones in the air. So I remember, being on my phone and my WhatsApp just starts going crazy when it happened. And the other one I think about is the CDK in the U.S. With majorly in the U.S. with the car dealerships and financing, and when that went down, like the hundreds of thousands of cars not getting sold because of this problem. And so, what really comes to the forefront is how well do you know your vendors, right? So when you look at your supply chain, it's not only the ones that you work directly with, but maybe the ones that they work with, and so you start talking about fourth and fifth party along the way. Most large companies aren't very well aware of fourth party risk. So you can imagine when you get away from the Fortune 1000, people have very, very little idea of who's all impacting them and their ability to deliver on a day to day. And so I think in 2024, one of the big themes was like, hey, you better pay attention to to what's going on along the way, because if one of those people have a something happens to them and they can't perform the work that you're relying on them for, now you're in trouble. And the other side of that, mainly because of what I'm doing with Two Candlesticks, sometimes the smaller companies rely heavily on the big companies because of this situation because they can't afford so much. But now they're seeing even the companies with huge budgets for security are getting shut down and having huge impacts. And so, as a small business owner, like how in the world do you deal with that? And so I think it's really timely to be talking about supply chain because we're just seeing it over and over again how it has such a huge impact on what we do, even though it's kind of out of our control.
So I'm curious about this because supply chain security is something that the industry's been talking about for probably the best part of the last couple of decades. Why has it suddenly become so important, and why are we seeing the impact of these sorts of issues play out at such a big scale now?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. I think previously, this is my personal opinion, people saw third party risk as more of a compliance requirement and sort of a checkbox. And nobody really paid that much attention to it because they kind of had this thought of, well, if I protect all my stuff, I'm protecting my data and not a big deal, right? I think that's kind of how most people thought about it. I'm not saying everybody. I know there's somebody watching this going, that's not what I thought, but I get that. And so I think there's been more events now where, in some ways, people understand that the easiest way to go after a big bank is to hit one of their vendors. And we've seen that over the years, not just in 2024. It happened many times. We saw it with like Target years ago, right? So that's becoming more prevalent now because people are more aware. It's more the everyday lingo of like, hey, your weakness is the different people you work with, right? Not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to go after Bank of America. You're going to go after their vendors and try to get in that way because that's much easier route to get in. And so I think that's raised the awareness, and now people are more aware of it. And so you're seeing, every major company now has a third party risk program. That wasn't the case 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, procurement was doing it, right? Now almost everybody has one inside of security. But that's the Fortune 500, the larger companies. You get into some of these medium-sized companies, they're still struggling with how to do it.
And that fits quite nicely with how we think about this space because we almost assume that actually your supply chain is probably compromised, and let's work from that as
Yeah.
the basis on which we build our entire security stack. So, going for a zero trust, zero knowledge type approach is really where we think we can add a lot of value to the security infrastructure. How do you see those sorts of principles playing out in especially in the world of generative AI, where there's a huge number of applications that the organization, the enterprise, might not even be aware of that they're using because they're actually part of the shadow IT infrastructure. How do you think all of that is going to play out?
Well, so there's a couple different things there, right? So if I go back to where you started with the kind of zero trust idea of vendors, I think that's great because, and on both sides, I think it's great for the larger companies who are doing the due diligence, right, on a vendor because now you don't have to be as concerned about what's going on over there because it doesn't matter, right? You're ingesting it, you're protecting it. In some ways, you still have to make sure it's protected when it's sitting over there, right? But when you're ingesting data, there's a level of control there. What's interesting though is how that impacts the small businesses that are partners to the larger businesses. Because like, as a small business owner, I can tell you the weight of requirements of trying to go through procurement and legal and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes you just don't work with companies because it just is too much work to try to go through it all. You may have all the security you need, but it's a lot of work. So something like this could be an enabler for small businesses to now be able to work with bigger companies because it kind of alleviates that barrier to entry. Now, when we talk about the AI stuff, that's fascinating to me because one of the biggest problems I see anywhere is companies don't really understand which one of their vendors are using generative AI and how they're using it, and is their data impacted by it. It is a large unknown and one of the biggest concerns right now for any company. And if you're a CISO or an executive at a large company right now, and you're not trying to figure that out, you're behind. It's just everybody I talk to is trying to wrap their heads around that, and it's an unknown right now.
Just a question around the kind of state of readiness, because you kind of hinted on that. You can't be behind. You've got a lot of experience in financial services, which of course is highly regulated, highly competitive, lots of investment. How would you describe their state of readiness? And I know we've got things like the DORA regulation in Europe that is talking specifically about third-party risk. Are they driving this just because they need to from their own competitive need, or are they driving it because the regulators are going to hit them or reputation? And how far forwards are they thinking?
Both. There's there definitely is an aspect of it that uh, speeds it up because regulators require it, right? It's an easy way to get funding. We have to do it, or we're going to get in trouble, right? But I think most, if not all, are doing it because they need to protect their data and they understand it, right? They understand this is a requirement coming and we got to deal with it. The nice thing in financial services is typically, not always, but typically, money's not an issue, right? Because typically, financial services companies they have large budgets, and it's not endless. But in my experience, if I go to leadership and say, I need something, truly need it, I'm going to get it. Right. And so oftentimes financial services are the ones at the front. They're pushing the envelope. They're the ones out innovating. They're the ones developing patents. They're the ones that are out creating things internally. They're buying the newest products. They're doing development partnerships with startups, and they're kind of out there in the front. So typically with the financial services, you're seeing them first ones to adopt it, first ones out. Usually the regulators are learning from them, right? So I can remember at previous companies where regulators would come through and say, "Hey, what are you doing about this?" We'd show them, and then they would go take that to the other ones they'd go to and say, "Hey, over here they're doing it this way," and it helps to shape the regulations and how they audit and how they test. And so that's typically kind of how that world will operate.
So that's a really interesting point because I suppose it sort of ties into the previous point you made as well around the need to be able to onboard vendors that may be small businesses and often see the barrier to entry being quite high with these
Yeah.
highly regulated financial services organizations, right? And in my experience, there is a very big spectrum of sophistication with the financial services organizations as well. And, some of the biggest banks, they have security teams and tech teams that are more sophisticated than the biggest tech companies in the
Hmm.
world. And then on the other hand, you do have small organizations that that tend to outsource a lot of their technology. So from a perspective of having to collaborate with startups, how does this play out, and what are some of the models that you've seen work really well, for instance, where a startup can effectively collaborate with a financial services organization without becoming the risk to them?
Yeah, I personally believe the best way for a startup to interact, especially when they're early on, is through design partnerships. I think if you can get in the door early, what that helps you do is design your product to align to the needs of the financial services market, right? Because those financial services institutions are going to be able to help you with what regulations have to be compliant with, how does that interact with their systems. Most financial services companies are also dealing with a ton of legacy stuff. And so being able to handle that with your product and like, because a lot of times I see startups they're built to work with brand new companies. Right? They're assuming everything's in the cloud and everything's nice and pretty. There's no legacy stuff to deal with. And then they get into an environment like a bank and they're just like, oh God, like we're not built for this. Or the like 3,000 vendors that we work with, right? You know what I mean? So it's the scale of it is also really hard for a startup to sort of wrap their brain around. And so I always say it's a great way for them to learn, right? If you can find yourself into a design partnership with some financial services institution, you're going to learn a ton. It's also going to get you in the door. So when your product's actually ready, you've already been there for a while. It's easier to become a paid client at that point.
And I guess moving back to the AI piece because we can't avoid it. What is it specifically about AI that is causing these issues? Is it like the speed of computing? Is it just the fact that people have got access to tools that they didn't have before? Is it bad actors can now produce things like deep fakes? Is it all of the above? But in your view, what has AI really changed and shifted things exponentially?
Yeah. So a little bit of all of it. I think I was a little bit skeptical if we would have talked this year or this time last year about deepfakes. I was like, it's just videos. Like most, it costs a lot to make them, takes a lot of time. It's not really worth it for a scammer to do this and then try to get people to do anything. But that view has changed a lot. Right? They've gotten a lot better. Um, I've now recently been more aware and seen live what they're able to do with like live video and like WhatsApp and Teams, and it's incredible. Like if you're not really paying attention, you could easily get fooled because it's not a video you're launching on your device. You're actually in a Teams meeting or a WhatsApp video call. It looks real. Looks like we're just as we're here. there's little things you can see with like their eye movements and some unnatural things, and every once in a while you'll see a little glitch or something. But like that's going to get better, right? In the next 6 months, that stuff may be gone, right? So I think um, if people aren't starting to think about how do we protect that internally right now, again, you're behind. And I also think about that for just general consumers, like everyday people. Like, how do you avoid getting scammed? How do I avoid, like, people my parents' age or my grandparents' age, like, falling victim to these things? So I think deepfake is a real concern. And I can't remember the company or the dollar amount, but it was like hundreds of millions of dollars that just happened in Southeast Asia, where the CFO was duped by deepfake. So I mean, it's real. There's tangible examples of these things happening. So I think there's got to be deepfake training, just like we do with any other security awareness training. And so that's a big thing. I've noticed it in the last 3 to 6 months, more people talking about it. But the bigger issue I think for me is how AI is using our data and how companies are using AI to drive business decisions. And the fact that I still don't think that generative AI is ready for production. I still think there's too many errors. We still don't, and it's not ready, in my opinion. And there's a lot of people that have rushed out to put it into their solutions. And there's security tools using it. There's business tools using it. Everybody's trying to use it. I use it, but I use it for like creating documents, right? Or like helping me with like a thank you email or basic things like that. Great. But like one of like the holy grail in financial services is to use it for like rebalancing portfolios, right? It would be amazing, but it's not ready for that. It's nowhere near accurate enough for it. And so I think that's a huge fear of mine is that we've kind of jumped into it head first, without truly waiting to get it ready, right? Um, and like I said, the way it uses our data, where that data goes, we kind of know it for ourselves, but there's a lot of shadow AI going on. So like, who knows? But when you get to your vendors, how well do you know how they're using it, and are they using an entity they control, or are they just going out to Chat GPT or Claude and throwing it out into the public free version? No idea, right? And no way for you to really know if they are either, right? Other than asking and hoping, right? But all those things are a huge concern for enterprises right now.
And what does that mean from an enterprise risk perspective? Because all of those points you just mentioned, they're extremely difficult to monitor, right? So you only need one employee in your organization to upload sensitive data onto an unapproved AI application that might be hosting its servers in a jurisdiction
Yeah,
that you might not be compliant in. And it's effectively derailed your entire compliance framework, your entire security framework. So how do you deal with it where it almost feels like, it's not a new threat because these issues already
yeah,
existed before, but it's just amplified a thousand, a million
yeah,
times. Um, so yeah, what advice do you have
yeah.
for organizations?
So my general advice to anybody that will listen to me, it's been the same for a year or two now. It's not new. It's the same problems we've dealt with, just in a different form. It's having really good access management procedures, having really good risk management procedures, having understanding where your data is and what the data flows look like. These are not new things. We've known this for as long as I've been in security. We've been focused on it. User training is really important. Um, Understanding your SDLC and understanding all the different processes that go into any kind of development, whether it's AI or not, it's the same sort of thought process, right? So when you think about, um, you know, your vendors using AI, Well, it's the same third party due diligence program you've been doing forever. Now it's just another question you have to ask, right? And and now when you're looking at deepfakes, it's the same security awareness stuff you've been doing forever around social engineering. You just now have a different vector for it, right? So I think when we start thinking about sort of, what's coming, even like a prediction into 2025, I think that what AI has done is it's created this huge hyper awareness of things that we should have been doing for a long time and we haven't been. And I think instead of having a bunch of new sexy stuff coming in 2025, there's going to be a huge refocus of doing the fundamentals really well. And I think where that's going to also be driven from is the fact that people's budgets are staying flat or even getting cut. And so you have to think about, okay, well, how do I improve my security? Well, I really focus in on the fundamentals, like really good patch management, really good IAM, really good data management, really good and asset inventory, like really good third party risk. If you do those things really well, then whatever a new risk is, whether it's AI or quantum computing or something else, it just goes right into your framework and you process it just like any other risk.
And I think that's the key point here. It's about doing the same things more consistently
Yeah,
instead of trying to find new ways of doing it,
right.
right? That's always something that we feel very strongly about at Clarity as well, because very often we get approached by clients who are saying to us things like, we left a document with some payroll information on a server unencrypted, and we were okay up till now because nobody knew that that document
Yeah,
was there on that server. So the
right.
fact that nobody knew it was there meant that we were okay.
Good old
But now
security through
suddenly
obscurity. Yeah,
exactly. And now all of a sudden we've got all of these generative AI applications that just scan
yeah,
through all of the data. We can't get away with it anymore
right.
because these applications are just going to hoover up and discover the data where people just didn't know about it before. And I think that's where it becomes extremely important to have the consistency. So we always think of this as the role of the next generation security has to be around removing the users from having to make these decisions because that's the way we achieve consistency and enabling the users to always do the right thing consistently every single time.
Yeah,
And to do that, AI is a tool as much as a threat in this space.
yeah.
So just moving on to a slightly different area now. So you have a very broad perspective of different markets around the world, and security is a global problem.
hmm
So keen to hear your perspective on what's happening in some of the emerging markets that maybe don't get as much attention as it should, and some of the really interesting things happening around the world. I mean, you just got back from a trip from Uganda, I
Yeah,
believe, and that looks like an amazing place. So we'd love to hear your experiences of some of the emerging markets in Africa and what's happening
yeah,
around that part of the world.
yeah. It's fascinating. So yeah, I was in Uganda last week for a Data Protection Africa Summit, and there's representatives from just about every country in Africa shows up. And what's interesting, I've been going to these summits for 2 years now. So last year it was in Ghana, this year was in Uganda, and it's pretty consistent that as a continent, they're trying to figure out what's the right regulatory model to ensure that they're protecting people's data and that companies understand how to do that, right? How to have the right framework, how to have the right governance structure. And I think from a like privacy and somewhat AI, they in a lot of ways just copy the EU. Right, so GDPR and the AI Act, those are things they just pull down. But there is really active conversations around what's the right way to do it, right? And so there's an idea that Europe regulates, America innovates, and trying to find this sort of middle ground of what Africa wants to be, right? And when you talk to the different countries, they all have a little bit, they're on that spectrum somewhere, right? And I think, especially in Africa, you're seeing this conversation of trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up, sort of like with the regulatory stuff, right? And so it's a really interesting time to be involved. You see some countries that are heavy on the regulation. They think that's the way to go forward because protecting individual data rights is the most important part. Then you have other countries that are like, hey, we need to create a culture of innovation in the country, and if we regulate too much and we're too prescriptive, then we're not going to allow that innovation to come about. And then your smartest people, your really gifted people, just leave, right? And they won't stay. Which is that's a whole different problem that Africa has in general, right? So one of the things I'll tell you, like a lot, I won't name the countries, but a lot of the countries have an issue where they're not creating enough cybersecurity talent to come through, right? And so, well, what does that cause? So all these companies that are in the country don't have a talent pool to hire from for cybersecurity professionals. So they end up having to hire people from out of the country, or they're outsourcing everything to some kind of managed service, or they just don't do it, right? One of those things. Um, and as Africa grows, the economies are getting bigger. They're starting to have bigger companies show up. They're wanting to create an environment for new companies to sprout up. There's nobody there to teach them how to do this, right? Or to staff their security teams. And so it's just an interesting market, right? So they're in dire need of um, really foundational security tools, right? Because a lot of them have some basics, like they'll have like EDRs, and they'll have some email security, and they'll do some like phishing awareness training, stuff like that. And they'll have the basics with firewalls and that sort of thing. But when you get more advanced into talking about like SIMs or orchestration or some of the ways they do identity access management and web applications is I'll just say a little behind the West, right? So tools like Klarytee become really interesting because now you're able to sort of lock in the security of the data as it's moving. And so it's just a really open a really open market, but they're hungry. They're really hungry to learn, and there's a new generation coming up in Africa that really wants to not only learn it but start to teach the younger generations that are coming up. And so you're getting this, especially in countries like Ghana, where there's a really cool like young security group. I'll just call it like there's men and women there, and they're really trying to push that agenda to get more of a security culture inside the country, which is amazing to see. And so one of the things I'm trying to work with a couple of nonprofits in Africa about is creating some kind of security training in the universities because it just doesn't exist, right? There's very few universities in the entire continent that are teaching cybersecurity. And so if you're a kid growing up in West Africa or even in East Africa, like you don't have a lot of choices outside of leaving the continent to go to university if you want to be a cybersecurity person. Um, so anyways, that's sort of what you're seeing there. And I think it's a really cool time to be involved as I think they're trying to make that next kind of step into being more aligned. It's just one of the missions of Two Candlesticks is trying to help them get there and sort of get above that sort of cybersecurity poverty line, right? Get above it so that they can actually protect their data and their population can be more security aware and be safe from scammers and terrorist recruiters and all those things. It's an everyday part of their life.
So that's really interesting that you mentioned the word culture quite a few times just then. And you also mentioned regulators a few times there, right? No, I'm a big believer that security is fundamentally a cultural problem because if you can build a culture of security awareness from the ground up, from day one, then that's always going to be your best way of dealing with any new threat
Yeah.
because fundamentally your people are more aware of what the right thing to do is. Um, what role do you think regulators play in defining that culture? And what are some of the examples that you've seen where regulators have been able to help foster that culture of security?
Yeah, I think some regulators are more proactive in communicating kind of what's going on. Like, so, example is right now I'm working with Data Protection Office in Mauritius on a guide for generative AI for the country. Right? And so that's an example of a country who's actually trying to proactively talk to the citizens and the companies in the country. Say, hey, here's what it is. Here's ways you can use it. Here's risks that you should be worried about, and also here's the different regulations that exist in Mauritius that you should be aware of when you're using this, so that you make sure you're compliant.
So just to
Yeah.
clarify, the regulator is actually working directly with the citizens in this
Yeah,
case.
so they're going to publish this guide out so that the
Okay.
citizens can go read it and learn about it, and or the companies, however. But it's putting out information for the population. Now, it's not going to jam it down people's throats, but like it's there. So if somebody is interested and wants to know more about it, there's official government materials they can go read and learn. So for me, I think those are great examples. The more education, the more materials you can provide to the population, the better. Um, as far as far as the culture, I think regulators can set the tone for the country, right? And I think recording this in London, and depends on who's watching this. People might get a little offended, but if you look at the level of innovation in like the U.S. compared to the UK or compared to Europe, it's really not even comparable, right? Like UK and Europe innovation is like pegged, and the U.S. is way above it. And I think that's a direct result of the way we regulate. All right. So when you compare the U.S. and Europe and UK, the way we regulate, meaning, if you look at some of the European regulations, they're very prescriptive in how you do something, right? If you compare that to US will say something like, the New York Department of Financial Services is a great example, because it'll say like, you need to encrypt your data based on a risk assessment. So like the whole document just based on a risk assessment, based on a risk assessment. And what that does is it allows companies to come up with solutions for how to do those requirements in a way that works best for their company based on their risk assessment. So as long as you can go to the regulator and say, hey, we did a risk assessment. Here's what we're worried about. Here's the controls we have in place. Here's why we think we're okay with this based on our risk tolerances and the controls we have in place. But whereas in Europe, it's not going to work that way. It's going to be, okay, I did this A, B, C, D things you told me I had to do, even though I don't need to do B, C, or D. Right? I still have to do them. Right? That kills innovation, because people then just checkbox, 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 and then you're also creating a situation where you're overspending on compliance because it's stuff you don't actually need, but you have to because of the compliance requirement. So it's something that emerging markets have to figure out, because they need to decide, do they want the culture where it's more of innovation, or do they want the culture where it's more of very specific requirements. Now, the other sort of, I won't call it a downside, but the other thing to be aware of, if you're going to go more towards that innovation and letting companies kind of decide, you have to hire really knowledgeable auditors, because now you can't. So if you're just doing check boxes, it's a little easier. You can send people out and they're just validating you're doing these four things, right? Very specific. But if I send you out to go see if this person did the correct risk assessment and that their control design is in alignment with that risk assessment, they have to actually understand what they're looking at to be able to go and say, yeah, this is an adequate risk assessment, and this solution actually makes sense based on what they said the risk assessment was, the risk tolerances, so we're okay. That becomes a problem in somewhere like Africa, where they don't have the resources to do that, right? So these are all sort of things they are having to work through right now, is how do we do that? And if we want to go more innovation route, how do we train and get enough auditors to be able to actually do it?
yeah, not very easy problems to
No.
solve any of these. But yeah, I think it's a hugely exciting space and one that we definitely want to get more involved in
Yeah.
the future. Um, so yeah, just kind of wrapping things up. I'm this is kind of a end of year podcast
Yeah.
that we're doing, so we'd love to spend a bit of time on reflections on 2024 and maybe the top three lessons you learned this year.
So I'll do this two ways. I'll do the top three I learned personally, and then kind of for the security industry. So I'll start with the security industry. I think security industry we learned that AI is not just hype. It's very much real, and it's not going anywhere. I think there was a large portion of people that just thought this might just kind of fade away a little bit, but it's definitely not. I think that people the second thing I would say is that people realized how many things they kind of took for granted weren't good. So back to what we're talking about with the fundamentals, like there's a sort of re-engagement of going back and making sure, like, all right, do we have these things in place and are they operating where they're supposed to? And I think the third thing is we're learning how to deal with um, as an industry, let me move back up a little. As an industry, we've always heard security has negative unemployment. And it was so easy to find a job in security and all those things. And that's not true anymore. And it really started happening in 2024. What's really interesting, I think, as we watch the security industry go forward, is we're still seeing, all these reports saying that we have hundreds of thousands of jobs that are unfilled, and we have this supply or the supply problem. There's a skills gap, blah 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 blah. There's also a whole lot of security people unemployed right now, a whole lot. And so what we're learning is there's a skills mismatch, and we have a whole lot of security people that don't have the new skills that we need to go forward. And that's been an interesting, I think, learning curve for the industry. Like if you look at like CISOs and how they're moving around, that job market is awful. Like there's very few open roles. Whenever you have a CISO role come open, there's hundreds and hundreds of applications, and they're all really good. Like they're not just people, shooting for the stars. I mean, these are people that have been CISOs for a while, like hundreds of them. So I think that's been something as an industry that we're trying to figure out what to do with that learning. But it's something that's happened this year, maybe for the last year and a half. But it's everybody thought that was going to be a short term thing to happen kind of in the last year, and it's definitely not. It's just continued. So, anyways, those are probably the three things I would say in 2024. Um, for me personally, it's been interesting. Um, really learning how the emerging markets work. Um, I started into the journey last year. This year, really got into it. Um, just learning how, when you're in a financial services firm in the US and then you compare that to everywhere else in the world, it's night and day difference. And so sometimes it's easy for us to just think, oh, everybody has that. Like that's an easy thing, but they don't, right? And so trying to figure out how to help these other countries, these other companies kind of get up to where they need to be has been pretty interesting. And I would give this advice that I've kind of learned to anybody listening. It's, you know, be there in person. Right? And so I think what we've got into the habit of, especially in COVID, we got so comfortable with Zoom meetings and team meetings and never going in the office anymore. And so I think it's kind of ironic we're doing this in person as I'm talking about this, but we just don't see that much anymore. You don't see people going and being in person and doing work together or producing things together. And this year I made a conscious effort to like just be there. So, whether it's going to Africa or Asia or Europe or somewhere in the US, whatever, go be there, be in person, and those relationships get way stronger and it helps you with collaboration. Like so many times this year where different security issues come up and like being able to reach out to somebody who you just saw like last month or whatever, and you talk to them, you have that connection, which is way stronger. You're going to get more help. You're going to get more, you're more comfortable sharing information with somebody you're hanging out with in person a couple times a year versus somebody you just talked to on WhatsApp and you haven't seen them in 5 years. Right. So I think that's something that I will probably start seeing more and more of as people start to remember how important it is to like actually spend time with people in person.
I definitely agree with that sentiment. I think it makes a huge difference when you build relationships in person
Yeah.
instead of over a Zoom call. So, of course, we can't let you go without getting your predictions for 2025. So, what do you think are going to be the three biggest things we're going to see in the security industry in 2025?
So I think you're going to see a bunch of AI vendors show up. Like I think, and
We've
some of
seen
the,
that already, haven't
yeah,
we?
but you're going to see so many more. I think there's going to be a rise of agentic AI coming in 2025, where we're going to start to see AI that really could start to replace people, very specific tasks. I know there's a few companies that are going to probably come out of stealth in 2025 that could really be game changers in that world. So I would say that's definitely something I expect to see, which will fundamentally change how we build security teams. Um, so that could be really interesting. I think the other piece of it is you're going to see more and more people forcing people to go back to work in the office, and that's going to create an interesting I don't even know what to call it, interesting attitude amongst employees and what they do. If they actually do go back to work, or do they start to look for other places to work? And it could create some risk because now people are moving around and there's a lot more movement. Um, and I think the other thing is again tied to AI. I think there's going to be more and more deepfakes, and they're going to get better. And it's not just the video deepfakes, but it's the voice deepfakes and different ways we can use it. I think they're getting so good that the normal consumer, the normal person, isn't going to be able to detect it. And you're going to have some kind of technology there to protect people because it's just going to be too good for the human eye and we can't deal with it. But one of the things I try to tell people is in financial services, we have uh, pretty much anybody has this process. Like when somebody wants to move money, like some kind of money transaction, there's a callback feature, right? So you call a known number to make sure that it's really them. That's a really easy sort of way to deal with a deep fake. Like, okay, cool, I got it. I'll call you right back on this number I know. And if it's a scammer, they're not going to answer, right? So that's a way around it. But I think there's going to be more and more of that. I think one thing I'd love to see somebody create in 2025 that I haven't seen yet is a human detector for like Zoom calls or team calls or WhatsApp calls. Like just some kind of technology that sits there and goes, this is 95% a human, like the likelihood or whatever, just so people can start to have an idea, some way to detect it. That would be amazing. So if somebody's wants to work on something, that would be, I think, a great thing to do. But I think there's going to be more and more AI, and there's going to be, like I said before, people are going to focus more on the fundamentals. There's going to be more agents for AI, and I think the sort of workforce dynamics will be something that will sort of define this next 12 months.
Amazing. Can't argue with any of those. I think that's spot on with what we're seeing as well.
Great.
Great. Well, that just maybe brings us to the end of the podcast, and just to thank you for your time. And what have you got next? Where are you traveling to next? Where can people find you? Because we've spoken a lot about human connection, right? Where are you going to be next?
Yeah, I'm finally going to be home for a little bit.
Yeah.
Be home for the holidays. But then I will be next. I think the next trip is back to London in January, and then in February I'll be in Banff for another security conference. So
Amazing.
just travel around.
Well, we're lucky to track you down here in London, so thank you again. And also a big thank you to CMS law firm who have provided this location, great location in London to film.
Yeah,
So
it's
thanks
been
again.
fantastic.
Tune in for the next episode and subscribe. We'll have details of everything that we've spoken about in the show notes as well. So thanks again.
Thanks
Thanks,
for
Nathan.
having me.
Thank you.